Welcome to Recorder Central. I'm really excited to be doing this Recorder Care Day with you today. It's the first time that I'm doing it, and thank you for showing up both in person as well as on Zoom. And I prepared a quick PowerPoint presentation for you just so that we're all using the same terminology. We all know that the recorder consists of three joints. Here is the head joint, middle joint, foot joint. The middle joint has the tone holes in it, varying sizes. Some of them are double. And in the back, you have the thumb hole that we can't see on this particular depiction. And here is the foot joint. That's all straightforward stuff. Little bit more intricate is the head joint. If I'm talking about the window, I will be talking about this area right here. And the window also has the labium, which is that sharp edge right here. And it's the thinnest part of the recorder. And up here is the windway. And on the back of this instrument, you can't see from this depiction, is the block. In order to show you a little bit more in detail, I took this picture from Philip Bolton's website. He is a recorder maker in France. And so you can see here is the block inserted into the instrument. This is the windway right here. And then this is the edge, or also called the labium, and all this here is the window. And the blue rectangle here, this is a detailed shot of it. And you can see at the exit of the windway are two small chamfers. They are shown here on the right. The top chamfer is on the instrument itself, and the bottom one is on the block. These stabilize the airflow, and they're necessary for the recorder's tone quality and speech. And their adjustment is quite intricate. So be careful when blowing out condensation water. This is where you could really hurt your instruments. How does a recorder actually produce a sound? Well, in very, very simple, plain ways. The air enters the recorder through the windway. It's directed towards the labium, and this creates vibration, producing sound waves. And here I have some more detailed images. Again, this is a crosscut of the recorder. Here's the windway. Air flows through the windway, gets towards that edge, the labium, and then it oscillates. Once it's going up, once it's going down. Here it also interacts with the air column inside of the instrument's bore. So, and these are images of the same cross section, right? You can see this black thing here is the edge. Here is the windway. And at some point, the wind goes above towards the outside of the instrument, above the labium. And here it goes on the bottom towards the inside of the instrument. And each time it reacts with the air column of the instrument. And these vibrations are causing the sound. The length of the air column inside of the recorder determines the pitch. So this is a picture of a low F on an alto. You see here's the thumb hole. It's closed with this red dot indicated. Here are all the other fingers closed. So on the alto it would be low F, or soprano it would be a low C. And covering all these holes makes this entire air column vibrate. Now, next image is of a middle range note, and you see this is an A on the soprano or D on an alto, and the air column is now shortened because these holes are open, and therefore it results in a higher note. And you can see that it's almost like it's cut off right here. There's a start line, and this is where the next hole is. So if you were to cut the instrument off, saw it off right here, you would get that length. So by opening and closing the holes, you determine the pitch. This is a little bit of a random slide, but I put it in here anyhow, because sometimes my students are asking, if I'm too sharp, do I pull out or do I push in? And the answer is always very simple. Think of your smaller instruments, Gartlein, sopranos, sopraninos. They are, of course, sounding quite a bit higher than the lower bass instruments. So if you lengthen, in other words, pull out your instruments, you're making the sound lower in pitch. So if you're sharp, pull out. All right, quick mention of the difference between Baroque and Renaissance recorders. The bore shape is one of the most important differences, but also the size of the tone holes, the shape of the windway, and of course, we're familiar with the outside shape. Renaissance recorders have a wider bore, they're more cylindrical. The tone holes are large and single holes, there are no double holes on that one. Wider, more straight windways, and usually a full rich tone in the lower and middle registers. So here is a Renaissance instrument, and again we're having that wide bore, large single tone holes, wider and a little bit more straight windway, and that results in nice lower full mid-range and lower notes. Here on the top now is a Baroque recorder, and you can see quite dramatically the difference between the bore. In this case, it's more narrow at the bottom and conical, it's tapered. If I were to take the head joint off, you can see it's wider here, thinner here. You can also see that the tone holes in comparison are, let me keep doing them the same orientation. I'm talking about the top ones now, that's the Baroque instruments. The tone holes are quite a bit smaller, and in the lower end of the instrument, we're having double tone holes. And the windway is more narrow. Baroque instruments are usually brighter in tone, better notes in the high, more notes in the higher register, and a little bit more refined articulation. You have all encountered the different materials of the recorder. They can come in plastic. Some of them are made in resin and others from wood. If you own plastic or resin recorders, their care is quite a bit easier. The main goal here is to keep the instruments nice and clean, and you can do that with a solution of warm water and mild dishwashing liquid. You shall make sure that the joints are always well greased, and the windway can be cleaned with a cardboard or a feather. Let me just quickly show you a little bit. I have my trusted plastic recorder. I have a bowl of lukewarm water where I added a little bit of dishwashing liquid, and I just take a cotton cloth. I dunk my cloth into the water. I make sure that it's not like dripping water, and then I wipe the outside of my instrument with this cloth that is moist. Just wipe it. Oftentimes in these rings there can be dirt if you look closer. The next step I will show you is to clean the windway. If I want to clean the windway, I need something that allows me to fiddle it through the wind canal because it's very thin, right? And so I found that toilet paper rolls are perfect for that. So keep a few of those around, and then I cut a small, roughly to the dimensions of the wind canal piece, just cut it off. And then I use alcohol, and I sprinkle some alcohol over this. Now you can see one side is wet, and I insert it into the windway. And that allows me, and you see it coming out on the other end here, that allows me to put some alcohol in there and take out all the goop and gunk. And then I take a dry piece to take out all the moisture and the alcohol that I put in there. But the good thing about alcohol, it just kind of evaporates, so you don't really need to dry much. Now towards the inside, take an instrument apart, take another cloth, different cloth, and use your normal cleaning rod that usually comes with an instrument. And you take that wet cloth again, can dunk it a little bit more into the water, making it a little bit more wet, and then I clean the inside of the instrument. Nothing special, nothing to it, right? So our instruments, the sopranos especially, that's why I've used this as an example, this is not fitting through it. So it's a little bit more involved. I sometimes just take the cloth itself, place it in there. You can see it coming through it. Or you can also just use the rod to push it through. The next step is I will just let it dry. Make sure that it's not moist anymore. Once it's really dry, I am taking my cork grease and I'm applying it generously to the joints. And that takes care of the plastic ones. Now, if you own wooden recorders, their care is just a bit more involved. Wooden recorders usually have two different types of surfaces. Both need slightly different treatment. You have varnished surfaces, and that's most frequently the outside of your instrument, except the windway and the back of the block, and sometimes the tone holes that are double, they are not varnished either. Varnished surfaces do not need oiling. Use a soft cloth dipped in that same soapy water that I used for the plastic instruments. Wring it out well, and then just wipe the varnished surfaces. For the mouthpiece, you can do the same thing that I did for the plastic recorders. Use alcohol to wipe the mouthpiece. If your instrument is a little bit older, then you might have worn down some of the varnish on the outside. Especially for me and some of my instruments, it's where the right thumb is placed. So feel free to just apply a very, very thin layer of oil on those spots just to even out the look of the instrument, the appearance. The other second type of surface is the unvarnished surface, and that's usually the inside of every instrument, the bore, the back of the block, and some of the double hole openings. Some fine handmade instruments don't have any varnish on the outside, so there it would be appropriate to oil the outside as well. How can you tell the difference? What's a varnished and an unvarnished surface? Unvarnished surfaces have wide open pores. They appear dull or matte when you look through the bore against the light. Varnished surfaces have the pores all closed. They appear shiny or glossy. This is probably the most important slide out of the whole slide presentation. Do not, under any circumstances, allow any oil to get into the windway, the edge of the labium, or the block. And that includes your personal oils that might come from lipstick or from having eaten before. So it's a good idea to always brush your teeth before you're playing. Now, why do we not want to oil the windway, the labium, and the block? In general, why do we even oil our instruments, right? The oil covers the pores of the wood and it makes it harder or impossible for water to penetrate. That protects the wood from swelling, and and the subsequent drying that happens after it gets wet. And that can change the measurements of the instrument. When you have slightly different tension on the head joints versus the middle joint, you can get cracks. Your instruments can also become out of tune when they swell at different rates, and that's one of the reasons why we want to oil. The second reason is you don't want to have any mold develop in your instruments. So if you keep the bore oiled really nicely, it prevents water from penetrating your instrument, and therefore mold is less likely to happen. And then also it can absorb dirt, and that's hard to remove from the inside of the bore or the windway. So isn't that a good thing then, oiling it? And why am I telling you to not oil the three areas that I showed you in this, the windway, the labium, and the block? We obviously want to prolong the life of our instruments, but those three areas pose a problem. Condensation that is caused by the temperature difference of your breath and the instrument itself forms little droplets of water inside of the windway. And because it is that narrow, it is prone to plug up. And it can completely plug up with a drop of water, and that adversely affects the sound. And then we have to stop playing and we have to blow out our plugged up windway. And that, of course, is super annoying. Now, how can you safely clear the windway if it happens? Step number one is minimize condensation by warming up your instrument. Bring your instrument to the same temperature of your body before you play. So you can either tuck it into your axle under your arm, or I personally put it into my belt, into my pants, because it's just allows me to do things with my hands before I play. But if you were to get condensation in, you have to remove it with a strong burst of air. And that is often done unsafely by placing the finger into the window. So I see a lot of people do this. They take their finger, place it into the window, and then blow really strongly. Now, I think I've been very clear telling you that this is the most fragile, thinnest edge of your instrument. This is where the sound gets produced. If you repeatedly place your finger, and with the finger comes the fingernail, into this area, you are more likely to harm it. So here's a better way of doing it. Take your head joint off, close the bottom of your head joint, and then place your lips around the window and force the air out that way. Make sure that when you're in a rehearsal, you don't spray your neighbor. But otherwise, this is a way safer way of doing it than placing your finger inside. Possibly you can still place it on the outside, but you're still causing a sound that is not that pleasant, that you might not want to do in a rehearsal. This is quieter. The frequency of oiling depends on the intensity of your usage. It says in most recorder instructions to do it twice a year with normal use. Now, what is normal? For a student that is playing recorder in university, practicing 8 hours is normal. For other people, practicing half an hour a day is normal. Maybe for you, it's normal to go to the Recorder Society meetings once a month, and then that's your normal. So however your frequency is, do it at least twice a year. When you are using it more often and more heavily, do it 3 to 4 times a year. And as I said earlier, in the Santa Ana conditions where we have very low humidity, it's a good idea to do it a little bit more often. And by the way, the Mollenhauer website recommends for everybody 3 to 4 times a year. All right. Let's get ready and actually start working on oiling our wooden instruments. The first step is prepare your workspace. And we're doing that for 2 reasons, right? Your workspace might not interact well with oil. You might have a nicely varnished table that you don't want to get any sticky goopy oil on. And then also keep in mind that your recorder's are round. They love rolling and they might fall off your table. So what I do is I take a tray. The tray has edges, so I can be assured that my instruments do not roll off the table. The next thing is I gather the instruments that I want to oil today. And then I gather all the supplies that I will be needing. And that is on our next slide. We need oil. And the 2 best choices are food grade almond oil. And it's also called sweet almond oil in some stores because they have added a vitamin E as a preservative to make it less likely to get rancid, or raw linseed oil. And I want to make sure that you know it's raw linseed oil versus boiled linseed oil. And the boiled version contains a polymerizer, and that's oftentimes a lead salt. And it A, creates a goopy mess, and B, we don't want any lead anywhere near our mouth. So we need cleaning rod. That's the one that comes with your instrument. 3 lint-free rags, one for cleaning, one for applying the oil, and one for wiping off the excess oil. Mild dishwashing liquid or alcohol. Pipe cleaners. And those are not really pipe cleaners that have like a bottle brush kind of thing, but it's more the chenille ones, the softer ones that kids use in school for crafting. We need empty toilet paper roll. Kitchen towel paper roll works as well, or if you can find one, a feather, and then make sure you wash it well. And we're using that for cleaning the windway. Then you want a small piece of aluminum foil if your instrument has a key, and I will talk about that more a little bit later. And then I already mentioned surface protection. You can use paper towel, paper bag, or in my case, I like using a little tray. That helps me make sure that my instruments don't roll off. I have linseed oil today. Here is my cleaning rod. Then I have a multitude of rags, just old pieces of cotton cut up. Then I have already washed the outside, but I also have alcohol. And here are pipe cleaners. Those are the chenille kinds. Then I have my trusty toilet paper roll. And I have small pieces of aluminum. And I will show you in just a moment how I oil my instruments. So here is a wet cloth, and I just literally wipe the outside of my instrument off. I'm paying close attention to the joint because sometimes they accumulate the cork grease as we're putting the foot joint into it. We're shoving the cork grease towards this edge. So I just take a paper towel and wipe all the excess cork grease that might have accumulated off. And here I'm one more time taking that wet cloth and wiping the recorder off from the outside. The mouthpiece, just like I did with the plastic instruments, I'm taking a piece of cardboard from my toilet paper roll. I'm cutting off a strip in roughly the dimension of the wind canal. And then I dunk that into my alcohol. And then I feed that into the wind canal until it comes out on the other side, and that you can see. That way I know I've cleared out everything that is accumulated inside of the wind canal. There we go. It's coming back out. You can see it. Wonderful. So this is taking care of the outside and the wind canal. Before we oil, we have one more step to do. If your instrument has a keypad, they should not come into contact with the oil. The oil will eventually harden, and that'll have a detrimental effect on the mobility of the keys. And that's why I earlier listed a small piece of aluminum into the list of items you need. We will place it between the keys and the instrument, wrap it around the key so it stays in place and protects the keys from getting any oil. So here is the foot joint of a tenor instrument, and I'm taking my piece of aluminum foil. I place it between the instrument and the keypad, and then I wrap it around so that it's well protected and the keypad stays, even when I now oil the inside, that nothing gets onto the keypad. All right, now we're going to start oiling the middle joint and the foot joint. And we're taking our cleaning rod. We are taking a piece of that cloth into the cleaning rod. And then I like to prepare a little dish. I just have these little glass yogurt. I think they came from yogurt vessels, and I take a little bit of my linseed oil and put it in here. Not very much needed, just about this much. Now I take that lint-free cloth, and I want to make sure that I don't go into the instrument like this, right? Because this has the sharp edge of the plastic rod. I always want to make sure that I'm somehow wrapping the fabric around it. and then I dip it into my oil. Dip, dip, dip. And now I'm just taking my my middle joint, and I go in and out, making sure that I also turn it a little bit. I know that I started on the bottom, went about halfway in, so I will turn it and go from the top of the middle joint. And then you can just kind of look through it and check whether it's taken some of that oil or whether it still looks dry. To me, it still looks a little bit dry on the lower end of it. You can also reapply some oil if you feel like it. And I'd like you to, you can watch this video and pause it at any time and repeat exactly what I am doing. So I'm looking through it. Ah, it looks nice and shiny now. Big difference. But only on this side, so I really need to wipe a little bit more on the top part. Good. Once you've oiled it, I like to place mine lying down. Some people stand them up. I like to place mine down and then rotate it once in a while so that maybe any loose excess oil that is still in there gets rotated around. And then I will do the same with my foot joint. Same oil rag, has enough oil in it. Oh yeah, oof, nice and shiny. I can see it from I don't know if you can see it through this light situation. It's not as ideal, but it's looking much more shiny and you know, like after rain, the street looks wet versus how it looked before. Beautiful. I started with the middle and the foot joint on purpose because the head joint is a little bit more involved. But before we get to the head joint, I would like you to do one more thing. This is that little chenille pipe cleaner that I mentioned and listed as one of the items you need. You dip that into your little oil vessel, and we're using this to oil the finger holes. So here we go. I want to make sure that they get some oil too. Even the little double holes. And don't forget you have one more hole in the back. You can see that the yellowish end is the end with the oil in it. And I am going to go straight away in there and take out all the excess oil. Because I tell you what, this is the way how instrument makers tune an instrument. They are adding wax on the inside of the tone holes. If this oil were to harden, if we're putting too much and we don't take the excess off, it might just act like a little piece of wax, and it might change the tuning of our instrument, which is something we do not want. You can then also go one more time with your rod and your claws through the instrument in case that you've applied a little bit too much. You can just take it off. Any excess that might have occurred right now, we'll just wipe it off, wipe it in both directions. There you go. And now let's do the head joint. You always want to hold the head joint upright or in the minimum at an angle upwards so that none of the oil can flow or run into the block area, into the wind canal. And even the lower end of the block, the inside lower end of the block should not come into contact with the oil. And how do I prevent that from happening? I'm measuring the length from the bottom of the head joint to the labium, and I'm measuring that on the outside with the rod, and then I'm using my thumb as a stopper. Let me stop the share so I can show it to you a little bit. So this again is my oil. I'm going to refresh it, put a little bit more oil on it. Now on the outside, I am measuring from the bottom till about here, because remember, we do not want any oil at the edge or at the block, or for sure not in the windway. So I'm measuring it from the outside, and I'm putting my thumb right in here. So when I now place it inside, my thumb acts as the stopper, and I know I am not reaching the block. So I can now safely, I'm rotating the instrument so I get the bore on the inside very evenly. I'm rotating it. So that helps me relax about the fact that, no, I definitely did not touch the block, because I blocked it off here with my thumb acting as a stopper. Good, that was the bore of the head joint. It still leaves two more areas. And I like to use a very thin little brush. It's not bigger than this. And again, you see that I kept holding my instrument upright all this time. And then I'm using this little brush, and I'm brushing the window this way. And I'm stopping short of the edge. You see that it's very glistening on the bottom, but I stopped short of the labium, the edge. And then I also do a little bit on the sides here of the window. And then I have more, I just use the excess oil that I have here. And I do oil the back of the instrument, but again, I don't want to get it too close to the windway, so I'm stopping short of, you can just do it this way, stopping short of the windway. I'm wiping off the excess, and this I do want to stand up. Unlike the middle joint where I mentioned that you can have it lying and once in a while rotate it a little bit so that the excess oil just kind of covers the inside of the bore. In the head joint, you want to stand it up. This is the joint that I wrapped the key with the aluminum foil. I also want to keep that up because it just allows me to know where the oil flows, and I want to kind of control that away from that keypad. Now, if you have one of those fine handmade instruments that does not have a varnish on the outside, this would be the moment where you take this particular cloth that still has some oil in it, and you would wipe the outside of your instrument. I'm not doing this with this one because this does have varnish on it, but this one is a little bit, I don't know if you can see it, but it's a little bit different. It's from use. It's a little different color, so I'm going over it right here, and that just kind of evens out the coloring a little bit. If your instruments are varnished on the outside, skip this step. Now you're done. Stand the head joint upright, lay the middle and the foot joints down, rotating them once in a while, and let them dry for at least 10 to 12 hours. So ideal is it, if you were to do it in the evening, to dry it overnight and then wipe any excess oil off with a clean cloth. Start with the outside, then use the inside of the bore. And don't forget to take the excess oil off from the finger holes. You can use another piece of your pipe cleaner. And I explained earlier that the oil can harden and can have a detrimental effect on the tuning of your instruments. Now let's address a few problems. Some of my students have the difficulty that the joints don't come apart easily. The most obvious thing is add some cork grease. If you don't have cork grease, Vaseline works well, but cork grease would be available in any musical stores that carries any kind of wind instrument supplies. You can also sand off a minuscule amount of the cork with fine sandpaper. Use 400 or even, sorry, there's a mistake right here, or even 1000 grit. Now, if the cork were to break in this process, don't worry about it. You can always replace the cork with thread and I like using polyester thread instead of cotton because cotton absorbs and swells, and then when it gets moist, it makes separating the joints even more difficult. So I have a piece of sandpaper from my orbital sander, and it's a 400 grit. I'm cutting it to roughly the dimensions of the joint, and I'm going to pretend that this joint might actually be too tight. So I put it around the sandpaper, and then I turn it because I want to take off an even amount on all sides. I don't want to just go like with my hand and sand one part off. So by doing it this way, it's more likely that I'm doing it fairly even. And then keep trying whether it's now fitting better into your joint or not. Now, if your head joints are too loose, you can add something to it. You can either use dental floss and add, and you want to do it in a way that the loose ends are not totally loose and coming apart. But here you go, something along those lines, and then it might fit better. Another option is to use plumber's tape. This is what plumbers use to attach pipes to each other, or it's very, very thin, and it's a little broader and a little bit more easy to hide the beginning or the end. You can go around it once or twice. Here I'm being a little bit clumsy with it. There. That's another good way of dealing with it. Now, this instrument happens to be very, very old. And as you can see, half of the cork crumbled. See how much this thumb hole is worn? I think I've had this when I was 14, something along those lines. So what I'm doing is now I will remove every piece of cork, and I will put some beautiful blue polyester thread on it, and I'll show you in just a moment. Once I've taken off, I don't need you to watch me do this, but once I've taken off all the cork, I will show you how I add some thread. So this actually took no time, and I didn't even need a tool. You can see now all the cork is off. These are just a little bit of remnants of the glue, but this is good enough for me to start applying some thread. I want to make sure that it is polyester thread. I don't know if it doesn't show up very well in this camera here, but this is polyester material. And again, I don't want cotton because cotton will eventually absorb some moisture and will swell. So now, in great painstaking fashion, I'm going to go around slow by slow, layer by layer, and I'm going to push it down into the direction, and then I'm going to just add in a somewhat orderly fashion. Let me just do it this way. New thread. And you can see I will have to do it until I have the same height of this edge. Again, I'm going to turn the camera off so you don't have to watch me do this. Quick progress report. It's now a beautiful layer of thread, and I'm going to check. No, it's still too loose. It still feels very loose and wiggly, so I keep doing it until it has a snug but not too tight fit. This looks promising. Let me test again. Yes, this is good. It's not too loose. It's not too tight. Now I'm going to cut some of the string off, and what I do is I leave a little bit extra. I wrap the remainder off, and then I want to use cork grease because now I have a loose end and I don't want that to hang out and be loose. But if my instrument were to get really super tight, I would try to find the beginning and I can take off some of the thread. Adding some cork grease onto it. And that's it. So if you ever have a cork that is very, very brittle, like now I have this very brittle cork on the bottom to deal with, But I'm going to leave it for now, and I'm going to, yes, this is perfect. So I'm going to maybe add a little bit of the plumber's tape so that this is not too loose for me. Plumber's tape on the bottom, I add some more cork grease to it, and now the foot joint works really well. My instrument is just like new, freshly oiled, nice new joints. Now, if your instrument has mold in the windway or on the labium, it usually happens when the recorder is put away while it's still wet. And in order to have mold removed from a recorder permanently, you got to mail it into a renowned recorder repair place. Mold is very, very stubborn, and just like remediating it in a home when you have black mold in your bathroom, it requires some specific chemicals, and do not try that at home. You can do best by avoid mold from forming. Wipe your instruments out every single time after playing, and then let the instrument dry out. If you're transporting your instrument home because you just played in a group, make sure you unzip the bag or open the case once you're home. The block. I strongly recommend that you do not hammer out the block on your own. Blocks are made out of cedar wood, and that is a very different wood than the rest of your instrument. That might be boxwood or rosewood or olive wood or pear. They swell at different rates. And that is done on purpose, that the block is out of cedar, because that keeps the windway measurements nice and stable, and therefore you have a reliable instrument. You might get your block out, but you might not get it back in. So I strongly recommend to not remove the block. All right, almost done. Final thoughts. The remaining oil that you have left over, because you're using very little, should be stored in the refrigerator. These are food grade oils, and they do get rancid after a certain while. So they have a longer shelf life if you are putting them in the refrigerator. Here's another tip. Take a Sharpie, put today's date on the side of the bottle, because it's easy to forget when it has been the last time that you oiled your instrument. But that way you can go back into your refrigerator, take out that bottle of oil, look at the date, and it's like, oh yeah, it's been 8 months. Let me re-oil my instrument. Now, next spot here, dispose of the cotton cloths you use to oil your instrument. Linseed oil has a tendency to be self-combustible. If the circumstances are just right, you might get a little explosion. So what I do is I take a jar that has a lid, and now I will put my little cloth in here, even the one that I use with the alcohol. You can always get more of these cloths. I close the lid and I immediately bring it out into the trash bin that gets picked up as soon as the city comes. Last point, if your instruments are stored in a bag, do wash the bag once in a while. I link it as a reminder with my oiling. So each time I oil my instrument, I also wash my bags. And then what's very important, to dry them thoroughly, because they have those fairly narrow channels, and you want to make sure that they are really dry before you use it again. So if you have any one of these bags, they sometimes get yellowish looking here because of the cork grease or Vaseline. So if you put them in here, you know, some of that Vaseline will get onto your cloth. So that's why it's a good idea to wash these in mild soapy lukewarm water and then hang them dry and let them dry, so that all these very thin channels here can actually dry. If you have a case, what I sometimes do is I take a bottle of Febreze, something like that, and spray it, and then I take a dry cotton cloth and just kind of wipe it off to keep that fresh and away from mold and smelling funny. I want to thank you so much for joining me today for our first ever Recorder Care Day. I hope this took some of the worry out that some of my students have. They're nervous about cleaning their instruments, oiling their instrument, and in the end, it's not that difficult. Again, thank you for coming, and remember, A little play can make your day.